The scooter's engine screamed like a dying animal every time Sarah Thornton pushed it past 30 miles an hour. She'd been meaning to get it looked at for weeks, but weeks had a way of disappearing when you worked 14-hour shifts 6 days a week. The engine could wait, the algorithm couldn't. Her phone, zip-tied to the handlebars with a cracked screen protector she'd fashioned from packing tape, flashed its familiar warning. Time remaining 8 minutes. Completion rate, 88%. Account suspension threshold, 85%. Below the warning, the delivery address glowed in the fading Charleston light. 14 Trad Street, Historic District. The kind of neighborhood where a single mailbox cost more than everything Sarah owned combined. She was 24 years old, and she could feel every one of those years in the ache behind her knees, in the low-grade fever that had been climbing since noon, in the way her rain-soaked Fastel polo clung to her skin like a second layer of exhaustion. A freak afternoon storm had rolled through Charleston an hour earlier. One of those violent summer tantrums that arrived without invitation, flooded the streets in minutes and vanished just as quickly, leaving behind steaming asphalt and the sweet, rotting smell of wet oak leaves. The storm was gone. Its consequences were not. Now, before we go any further, I need you to understand something about the gig economy that most people never think about. That number on Sarah's screen, 88% completion rate, is not just a statistic. It's a leash. In 2024, the average delivery driver in the United States earned $4.50 per hour before expenses. After fuel, maintenance, and self-employment tax, that number drops to roughly $9.80, below minimum wage in most states. And the algorithm, that cold mathematical engine that decides which orders you get, which routes you drive, and whether you eat tomorrow, doesn't care that there was a storm. It doesn't care about your fever. It only knows that you have 8 minutes to deliver cold pad thai to a house in the historic district. And if you fail, your rating drops. And if your rating drops below 85%, your account gets suspended. And if your account gets suspended, you can't pay for your mother's oxygen. That's not a metaphor. That was Sarah Thornton's actual life. Sarah leaned into the turn onto Trad Street, and the world shifted. Later, she would replay those 2 seconds 1,000 times. The way the front tire caught the edge of an oak branch, thick as her wrist, torn loose by the storm, lying across the cobblestones like a fallen barricade. The way the scooter's bald tire, already struggling on the rain-slicked surface, simply gave up. The sickening sideways lurch as physics took over and human control became irrelevant. The scooter slid. Sarah slid with it, and both of them, girl and machine, skated across the wet cobblestones directly into the side of a car parked beneath a canopy of Spanish moss. The sound wasn't dramatic. That was the strange part. No explosion, no Hollywood crunch of metal, just a long, sickening scrape, like a fingernail dragged across a chalkboard, amplified to the frequency of financial ruin. Then the brittle pop of a taillight shattering, then silence. Sarah lay on the ground for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Her left knee was bleeding, the skin peeled back by cobblestone in a way that looked worse than it felt, though it felt terrible. The delivery bag had burst open, scattering someone's pad thai across the gutter in a sad constellation of peanuts and lime wedges. She stood up. She looked at the car, and her stomach dropped so hard she thought she might actually be sick. It was yellow, not the cheerful yellow of a school bus or a taxi cab, but the deep liquid gold of something that had been engineered at a molecular level to catch light and hold it. A Ferrari Daytona SP3. Sarah knew this because, before she'd been a delivery driver, before she dropped out of the Savannah College of Art and Design to cover her mother's medical bills, she'd spent 2 years studying automotive design. She'd drawn this exact car in her sketchbook during a late-night lecture on carbon fiber monocoque construction. She knew its price the way a medical student knows the names of bones, automatically, involuntarily, and with a precision that now felt like cruelty. $2.2 million. Limited production, 500 units worldwide. And she had just caved in 3 panels of hand-laid carbon fiber along its passenger side, shattered the right taillight assembly, and based on the ugly dent near the rear wheel arch, almost certainly damaged the electronic sensor array underneath. Now, let me put this in perspective. The Ferrari Daytona SP3 isn't just expensive, it's the kind of car that exists in a completely different economic universe. Each body panel is hand-laid carbon fiber, which means it's not stamped out in a factory like a regular car door. It's built by artisans in Maranello, Italy, layer by painstaking layer. When one of those panels cracks, you can't just order a replacement from a warehouse. You send it back to Italy. A team of specialists rebuilds it by hand. The cost for a single panel replacement can exceed $40,000. And Sarah had damaged 3 of them, plus a taillight assembly that costs more than most people's used cars, plus an electronic sensor array that requires complete recalibration at a Ferrari-certified facility. We're talking $150,000 to $185,000 in repairs for a car that most people will never even see in person, let alone touch. And Sarah's bank account, as of that morning, held exactly $112. "Oh God," she whispered. Then quieter, "Oh God, oh God." A small crowd was already forming. That was the thing about Charleston's historic district. It was never truly empty, just quiet in that cultivated southern way that could transform into an audience at the first sign of spectacle. An older couple in matching linen paused across the street. A man walking a golden retriever stopped and pulled out his phone. Whether to call for help or to film her, Sarah couldn't tell. 2 teenagers on bikes slowed down, one of them letting out a low whistle. "Dude," one of them said, "she's dead." He wasn't talking about her injuries. He was talking about the debt. Sarah's hands were shaking. Her phone was still zip-tied to the handlebars, still counting down, still threatening her with a count suspension, as if any of that mattered anymore. The pad thai was soaking into the gutter. Her knee was bleeding through her work pants, and the most expensive object she had ever touched in her life now bore a scar that ran from the door handle to the rear quarter panel like an accusation. Run. The thought arrived clean and simple, the way survival instincts do. The scooter still worked. She could hear it idling behind her, its terrible little engine puttering away as if nothing had happened. Nobody here knew her name. The Fastel uniform was generic, blue polo and baseball cap, indistinguishable from 10,000 other drivers in the Low Country. She could be 3 blocks away in 40 seconds. And here's where this story becomes something more than a viral headline, because what happened in the next 60 seconds reveals something profound about human character, something that no algorithm can measure, no financial model can predict, and no amount of money can buy. Sarah closed her eyes. She saw her father. Not the version at the end, diminished by the pancreatic cancer that had eaten him from the inside out over 14 months, but the version from before. Thomas Thornton, high school history teacher, varsity baseball coach, the man who once drove 45 minutes back to a gas station because his daughter had pointed out that the cashier had given them an extra $5 in change. He'd made Sarah walk in and hand it back herself. She was 9 years old, and she'd been furious. She understood now. Sarah opened her eyes. She reached into the back pocket of her work pants and pulled out a crumpled delivery receipt, the kind the app generated for cash on delivery orders, thin paper with a perforated edge. She smoothed it against the scooter's seat. She found the pen she always carried, a cheap ballpoint with a Fastel logo that barely worked when it was dry, let alone after a rainstorm. She pressed hard and wrote, "My name is Sarah Thornton. I lost control of my scooter and hit your car. I'm a delivery driver for Fastel. I currently have $112 in my bank account and no comprehensive insurance. I know I can't pay for this debt now, but here's my phone number and my address. I will pay 15% of my income every month until the debt is cleared, even if it takes the rest of my life. I am truly sorry." Think about that for a moment. A 24-year-old woman earning roughly $1,400 a month just voluntarily signed herself up for 73 years of debt. She would be 97 years old before the last payment cleared. She did this with no legal obligation, no police on scene, no witnesses who knew her name, no cameras that could identify her. She did it because a man who'd been dead for 2 years had once driven 45 minutes to return $5. And the lesson had taken root so deep that even financial ruin couldn't dig it out. There's a concept in behavioral economics called moral identity, the idea that people make decisions not based on what's rational, but based on who they believe themselves to be. Most people's moral identity is flexible. It bends under pressure. It renegotiates when the stakes get high enough. Sarah's didn't bend, it was load-bearing. And what happened next would prove that sometimes the most irrational decision a person can make is also the most valuable. She was tucking the pen back into her pocket when a voice came from behind her. "What did you just write?" Sarah turned. The man standing 3 feet away wore a charcoal gray suit with the kind of tailoring that made it look casual rather than corporate. No tie, top button undone, salt and pepper hair that was more pepper than salt, pushed back from a face that was handsome in the way of someone who'd stopped thinking about his appearance a long time ago. Mid-30s, maybe 37. He was holding a lowball glass with what looked like bourbon, the ice nearly melted. He'd clearly come from one of the houses. The door of the Georgian townhouse directly across the street was standing open, warm light spilling out onto the front steps. Sarah's mouth went dry. "Is this your car?" "It is," the man said. He didn't look at the car. He looked at her. "I heard the noise from inside. I came out and saw you." He paused and something shifted in his expression. "I saw you sit down and start writing. I was expecting you to check if anyone was looking and drive away. Most people would. I'm not most people." She hadn't meant it to sound defiant, it just came out that way. The adrenaline and the fever and the bleeding knee all conspiring to strip away the polite deference she usually wore like armor when dealing with people whose shoes cost more than her rent. The man studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he stepped past her, pulled the note from beneath the windshield wiper, and read it. The reading took longer than it should have. It was only 6 sentences, but he read it twice. And when he looked up, his jaw was tight in a way that Sarah couldn't interpret. 15% of your income every month, he repeated, for the rest of your life. Yes. You understand the damage here is probably over $150,000? I can do math, sir. Something flickered across his face. Not amusement exactly, something closer to recognition. He folded the note carefully, not crumpling it, not tossing it, and slid it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. And this is the detail that matters. He didn't throw it away. He didn't laugh at it. He folded it like a contract, like something with weight. David Sterling had spent 20 years evaluating people across boardroom tables, reading their tells, measuring the distance between what they said and what they meant. He'd watched CEOs lie with perfect eye contact and handshakes worth millions. He knew what performance looked like. And what Sarah had just done, writing that note for a stranger she didn't know was watching, was the opposite of performance. It was the most expensive act of honesty he'd ever witnessed. "What's your name again?" "Sarah. Sarah Thornton." "David Sterling." He said it the way someone gives directions, matter of fact, stripped of expectation. "I'll be in touch, Sarah." He turned and walked back toward the open door of the townhouse. No threats, no mention of police, no lecture. Sarah stood there, bleeding and bewildered, as David Sterling disappeared into the warm light of his house without looking back. The teenagers on bikes exchanged glances. The man with the golden retriever shook his head and moved on. The older couple in linen resumed their walk, murmuring to each other in tones of practiced Southern discretion. Sarah picked up the scattered remains of someone's pad thai, stuffed them back into the ruined delivery bag, straightened her scooter, and rode away to complete her last delivery of the day. The pad thai was unsalvageable, which meant a refund, which meant a penalty, which meant her completion rate would drop below 88%. She didn't care. She was thinking about the way David Sterling had folded her note carefully, like it was worth keeping. What Sarah didn't know, couldn't have known, was that David had come outside early enough to see everything. He'd watched the crowd form. He'd watched her stand over the damage with the engine still running behind her, every logical reason to flee. And he'd watched her sit down and write a 73-year repayment plan on a wet receipt while her knee bled onto the cobblestones. In 20 years of business, David Sterling had learned one brutal truth about human nature. When people believe no one important is watching, they show you exactly who they are. Sarah hadn't written that note for him. She'd written it for a stranger. She'd offered to mortgage her entire future, not for leverage, not for an audience, but because a dead man's lessons about $5 and change had built something in her that couldn't be bought or broken. David sat in his study that night, the bourbon untouched, Sarah's receipt smoothed flat on the desk. He read it again. 15% rest of my life. The handwriting was small and steady. No tear stains, no drama. Just a woman with $112 making a promise she fully intended to keep. He hadn't felt this unsettled by another person in a very long time. 3 days later, Sarah received a call from a number she didn't recognize. A woman's voice, brisk and professional. "Miss Thornton, this is Claire Huang from Sterling and Associates. Mr. Sterling would like to meet with you regarding a property damage matter. Are you available tomorrow at 2 p.m.?" Sarah spent that night Googling David Sterling Charleston on her cracked phone screen, sitting cross-legged on the mattress she kept on the floor of her studio apartment. A place so small that the kitchen, bedroom, and living room were the same room, differentiated only by which direction you were facing. Her mother, Grace, was asleep in the bedroom, the actual bedroom, the one Sarah had given up when Grace's COPD made the stairs in their old apartment impossible. The search results loaded slowly on her prepaid data plan, but they loaded enough. David Sterling, founder and CEO of Sterling Logistics, a supply chain and infrastructure investment firm valued at $2.3 billion. Forbes 30 Under 30 at 26. Cover of a Bloomberg Businessweek at 31. Known for acquiring underperforming logistics companies and restructuring them. Known also for a brutal divorce 2 years ago that had made the Charleston Society pages. His ex-wife, a real estate developer named Victoria Chen Sterling, had publicly accused him of being constitutionally incapable of human connection. Sarah closed her phone. She stared at the ceiling where a water stain from the apartment above had been slowly expanding for 3 months like a brown blooming flower. She was going to owe a billionaire $185,000 for the rest of her natural life. The next afternoon, Sarah walked into Sterling and Associates wearing the only non-uniform clothes she owned, Goodwill black slacks and a white button-down shirt that had belonged to her father. It was too big in the shoulders, but it was clean and pressed, and wearing it made her feel like he was standing behind her. There's something worth pausing on here. Sarah didn't own clothes for this meeting. She didn't have a blazer, a pair of heels, or a portfolio. What she had was her dead father's shirt, too big in the shoulders, slightly yellowed at the collar, and she wore it like armor. In any other story, this would be the moment the protagonist feels small, out of place, overwhelmed by the billionaire's world. But Sarah walked into that building wearing the values of a high school history teacher, and she didn't feel small, she felt ready. Claire Huang, who turned out to be a composed woman in her late 20s with architectural cheekbones and a handshake that meant business, led Sarah through an open-plan office where analysts sat behind curved monitors displaying supply chain maps and logistics data that looked to Sarah like the nervous system of a living organism. "He's in the corner office," Claire said, then added, almost as an afterthought, "He's been looking forward to this." Sarah didn't know what to do with that information, so she did nothing. David Sterling was standing at his window when she entered, looking out over the harbor. He'd exchanged the charcoal suit for something simpler. Dark jeans, a navy crewneck sweater that probably cost $400, but was trying very hard to look like it cost $40. The lowball glass from 3 nights ago had been replaced by a coffee mug with what appeared to be a faded Clemson Tigers logo. On the desk between them, pressed flat and smooth as if it had been ironed, lay Sarah's delivery receipt. Her handwriting stared up at her, small and desperate and brave. "Sit down, please," David said. He sat first, which she would later realize was deliberate, a way of giving her the power to choose her own position in the room. Sarah sat. She placed her hands flat on her knees to stop them from trembling. "The damage assessment came back yesterday," David said, opening a folder. "Total cost of repair and recalibration, $185,000. Carbon fiber panel replacement, taillight assembly, rear sensor array, and structural integrity testing." Sarah nodded. She had already done this math in her head approximately 700 times. At 15% of her average monthly income of $1,400, she would be paying $210 per month. It would take her, she calculated this at 3 a.m. with a calculator app and a growing sense of existential dread, approximately 73 years to pay it off. She would be 97 years old. "I stand by what I wrote," she said. David looked at her for a moment, then he closed the folder. I know you do. That's why I asked you here. He leaned back. I didn't ask you here to discuss repayment, Sarah. That note you left, it's financially meaningless. You know that, I know that. A lawyer would laugh at it. Then why did you keep it? Because in 20 years of business, I've watched people lie, cheat, and litigate their way out of far smaller debts. I've seen men worth $50 million dispute a catering bill. I once watched a hedge fund manager back his Porsche into a food truck in Manhattan and drive away while the owner stood there holding a broken spatula. He paused. You had nothing. You had every reason to run, and instead, I said, you sat down on the street and wrote a 73-year repayment plan on the back of a pad thai receipt. Sarah didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. I have a proposition, David continued. My firm is developing a project to restructure last-mile delivery infrastructure on the East Coast. We're looking at fleet optimization, route algorithms, driver compensation models. I have 37 analysts who can model supply chains in their sleep, but not one of them has ever sat on a scooter in the rain at midnight trying to deliver cold noodles to a customer who's going to give them 1 star regardless. Not one of them knows what the algorithm actually feels like from the inside. He turned the pressed receipt around so it faced her. I don't want your $210 a month, Sarah. I want 10 hours a week for 3 months. You ride along, you show me where the system breaks. You tell me what no spreadsheet ever will. If the project succeeds, your debt is cleared. Now, this is where David Sterling reveals something fascinating about how the ultra-wealthy actually think. He could have done anything with this situation. He could have written off the $185,000 as a tax deduction and never thought about it again. For a man worth $2.3 billion, that's the equivalent of someone worth $100,000 losing a nickel between couch cushions. He could have sued her, which would have been legally straightforward and financially pointless. He could have called the police, filed an insurance claim, and moved on with his day. Instead, he offered her a job. But here's what makes this offer brilliant rather than patronizing. He framed it as a transaction, not a gift. He didn't say, I feel sorry for you, let me help. He said, I need something you have, and you owe me something I have. He turned a power imbalance into a value exchange, and whether he fully realized it or not, that framing did something no amount of charity ever could. It preserved Sarah's dignity. Sarah stared at the receipt, her handwriting, her father's lessons encoded in ballpoint ink on cheap paper. That's charity, she said. David's expression hardened. No, it isn't. Charity is me writing off $185,000 because I can afford to, and it makes me feel generous. This is a business arrangement. I need what you know. You owe what I'm owed. The math works. The math doesn't work, and you know it. 10 hours a week of consulting doesn't equal $185,000. For the first time, David smiled. It was brief, barely there, the kind of smile that suggested he wasn't used to being argued with by anyone, let alone a delivery driver sitting in a dead man's shirt. Then consider the premium assigning bonus, he said. Do we have a deal? Sarah looked at the receipt. She looked at David. She thought about her mother's oxygen concentrator humming in the next room, about her suspended dreams of design school, about the scooter held together with hope and zip ties. We have a deal, she said. The first week was awkward in the way that putting a house cat and a mountain lion in the same room is awkward. They were technically the same species, but the scale differential made every interaction slightly absurd. David had insisted on experiencing Sarah's world firsthand, which meant climbing onto the back of her scooter, an act that required him to fold his 6'2" frame into a position that was anatomically questionable and dignified. Not at all. Claire Huang, who'd been asked to coordinate the logistics of these ride-alongs, had taken one look at the arrangement and pressed her lips together very tightly in a way that suggested she was using every ounce of professional composure not to take a photograph. Hold on to the sidebars, Sarah instructed before their first run. There are no sidebars. Then hold on to me. David Sterling, whose handshake had been valued by Forbes at $2.3 billion, wrapped his arms around the waist of a delivery driver and held on as she launched them into Charleston traffic with a casual disregard for personal safety that only someone who'd been doing this for 2 years could manage. By the end of the first delivery, David was pale. By the end of the fifth, he was asking questions. Why did the app reroute you away from King Street? That's clearly the faster path. Because King Street has 3 restaurants that are always behind on orders. The algorithm learned that drivers who get routed through King Street end up waiting, which drops their completion rate, which means the algorithm penalizes them in the next cycle. So now it avoids King Street entirely, which means those restaurants get even fewer drivers, which means their orders are even later, which means a death spiral. David finished. The algorithm is creating the problem it's trying to solve. Welcome to my life. What Sarah described to David over the next few weeks is something that economists call a perverse incentive loop, a system designed to optimize efficiency that actually destroys it. The delivery algorithm was supposed to get food to customers faster. Instead, it was burning through drivers at an unsustainable rate, punishing restaurants for problems the algorithm itself created, and generating a cascade of 1-star reviews that made the entire platform worse for everyone. It's the same pattern you see in high-frequency trading, in social media engagement algorithms, in any system where a machine optimizes for a single metric without understanding the human cost of that optimization. The algorithm was technically perfect. It was also technically destroying lives. These were the conversations that changed things, not the rides themselves, though those were revelatory enough. David watching Sarah navigate a pothole-cratered alley in the warehouse district at dusk, or waiting in the rain outside a customer's apartment for 11 minutes because the app wouldn't let her mark the delivery complete until the customer confirmed receipt, and the customer was in the shower. It was the gaps between the rides. The coffee breaks at the Marathon station on Meeting Street, where Sarah would sketch route maps on napkins, and David would pull up his analytics platform on his phone, and they'd compare what the data said versus what reality looked like. Here, Sarah said one evening 3 weeks in, drawing a circle around a cluster of streets near the medical district. This is where drivers go to die. Metaphorically, barely. The algorithm sends new drivers here because the delivery density looks high on paper, but these are all hospital orders. Patients who can't come to the door, nurses who ordered 40 minutes ago and forgot, cafeteria runs that get canceled half the time. New drivers take every order because they don't know they can decline. They get hit with cancellation penalties that aren't their fault, their ratings tank, and within 2 weeks, they either quit or get suspended. David was quiet for the moment. How many drivers has the app burned through in this zone in the last year? I counted once, over 300. 300 people. 300 people who needed the money badly enough to try to. He looked at her napkin map, arrows indicating traffic flow, stars marking problem intersections, tiny skulls drawn next to the addresses of customers who were known to leave false complaints for free food. It was crude, it was hand-drawn, and it was more operationally useful than anything his analytics team had produced in 6 months. You should have been an engineer, he said. I should have been a lot of things. She said it without self-pity, the way you'd comment on the weather. And David felt something shift in his chest that he couldn't name and didn't try to. By the 5th week, pretense had become unsustainable. When you work alongside someone 14 hours a day, on a scooter in traffic, over cold gas station coffee at midnight, the walls come down whether you want them to or not. Sarah learned that he ate the same lunch every day, turkey sandwich, no tomato, because making food decisions exhausted him in a way that making business decisions did not. She learned that his divorce had been worse than the society pages reported, that Victoria hadn't just accused him of being emotionally unavailable. She'd been right, and he knew it. She said, I treated our marriage like an acquisition, David told Sarah one night, sitting on the floor of his office surrounded by printouts of route data, a cold coffee growing a skin on the desk above them. Due diligence, integration plan, performance metrics. She wasn't wrong. Do you miss her? I miss being the person she thought I could be. Sarah learned to read his silences. The short ones meant he was thinking. The long ones meant he was remembering. He learned in turn that Sarah's mother had been a church choir director before the COPD stole her breath, that Sarah had been 2 semesters away from a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Industrial Design when the money ran out, that she kept a sketchbook in the storage compartment of her scooter filled with designs for delivery vehicles, electric, weather-protected, ergonomic. that she drew during her lunch breaks. These are exceptional, David said, turning the pages slowly. He'd found the sketchbook by accident, reaching into the compartment for a charging cable. Sarah took it back with the quick, embarrassed reflex of someone whose private world had been accidentally exposed. They're doodles. They're solutions. She didn't answer, but she didn't take the sketchbook home that night, which David understood was a form of trust he hadn't earned and didn't deserve but would try to be worthy of. And this is where the story shifts, because up until now, you might think this is a love story between a billionaire and a delivery driver, a modern Cinderella tale dressed up in supply chain jargon. It's not. What happened next turned this into something much darker, much more real, and much more important. The trouble arrived as trouble often does, wearing a name badge and a smile. Marcus Vance was the regional operations manager for Fastell's Southeast Division. He was 41, gym sculpted in the way of men who mistake physical discipline for moral character, and he ran his territory with the benevolent tyranny of a landlord who knows his tenants have nowhere else to go. The drivers called him the algorithm behind his back, partly because he worshipped the system, and partly because, like the system, he seemed incapable of recognizing human suffering as a variable worth measuring. Sarah had been a problem for Marcus long before David Sterling entered the picture. 6 months earlier, she filed a formal complaint through Fastell's internal portal, documenting a discrepancy in tip distribution. The app was showing customers that they'd tipped generously, but the amounts reaching drivers' accounts were consistently 18 to 22% lower than what had been charged. The complaint had been flagged, reviewed, and quietly buried. The person who'd buried it was Marcus. Now, with Sarah back on the road, something had changed. The good routes, short distances, reliable tippers had dried up. Instead, the app sent her to the edges. Johns Island, James Island, the far reaches of West Ashley, where the streets turned to gravel and the tips disappeared entirely. "Something's wrong with my routing," Sarah told Javier, a veteran driver she'd befriended during her first month. They were standing in the parking lot of the distribution hub on Rivers Avenue, waiting for the morning batch of orders to drop. Javier was 53, a former construction foreman who'd turned to delivery work after a back injury. He didn't look surprised. "Vance got to your account." "He can do that?" "Regional managers have override access. Technically, it's for route optimization in special circumstances." Javier made air quotes with fingers that were thick and scarred. "Practically, it's how he punishes anyone who makes noise. You filed that tip complaint, didn't you?" Sarah felt a chill despite the morning heat. "How did you—" "Because I filed one too. 3 years ago, my routing went to hell for 4 months. Then he offered me a deal. 20% of my tips kicked back to his driver relief fund, which is a personal Venmo account. I said no. My routing got worse. I said yes." Javier looked at the ground. "I'm not proud of it." "How many drivers?" "That I know of, maybe 40, but there could be more. Nobody talks about it. They're all scared of the same thing, getting suspended, losing their income, ending up worse off than before." What Javier described is not fiction. In 2023, the U.S. Department of Labor investigated multiple gig economy platforms for exactly this kind of tip misappropriation. The fundamental problem is structural. When a single manager has override access to an algorithmic system that controls thousands of workers' livelihoods, the potential for abuse is enormous. And the workers most vulnerable to that abuse, immigrants, single parents, people with disabilities, anyone living paycheck to paycheck, are the least likely to report it because reporting means risking the only income they have. Marcus Vance didn't invent this system, but he weaponized it, and he was about to find out what happens when you weaponize a system against someone who has nothing left to lose. Sarah stared at the delivery hub, a windowless concrete building with Fastell's blue logo painted cheerfully above a loading dock that smelled of diesel and desperation. 40 drivers, 20% of their tips, for years. "I need to tell David," she said. Javier looked at her sharply. "Sterling? You're working with David Sterling? It's complicated." "Sarah." Javier put his hand on her shoulder, the grip firm enough to communicate urgency. "Be careful. Vance isn't just some mid-level bully. His cousin is on Fastell's board. He's protected. And Sterling, whatever he's doing, however nice he seems, He's still a billionaire playing with a system that chews up people like us. Don't forget which side of the scooter you're sitting on. She told David that night in his office with Claire Huang taking notes and a recording app running on the table between them. She told him about the tip skimming, about the routing manipulation, about Javier and the 40 drivers she could name and the ones she couldn't. David listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stood up and walked to the window. Charleston Harbor was dark except for the lights of a container ship moving slowly toward the port terminal, carrying goods that would eventually be sorted, loaded, and delivered by people like Sarah. How long has this been going on? He asked. At least 3 years based on what Javier told me. And Fastel's corporate knows. I filed through official channels. Nothing happened. David turned from the window. His expression had changed in a way Sarah hadn't seen before. It was harder, sharper, the face of someone who'd made a career out of identifying broken systems and was looking at one now. Claire, he said, get me the due diligence file on Fastel, the full acquisition target portfolio. Claire nodded and left the room. Acquisition? Sarah asked. Fastel has been on my radar for 18 months. Undervalued company, strong market share, terrible management. I was planning to acquire them eventually. He sat back down. Eventually just became now. David, if Marcus finds out I've been feeding you internal data, he won't find out, not until it's too late for him to do anything about it. You don't understand. He'll destroy my account. He'll get me blacklisted from every delivery platform in the Southeast. And my mother, she depends on my income for her medication, her oxygen, her... Sarah. His voice was quiet, but it stopped her. I need you to trust me. She looked at him. Really looked. The way she hadn't allowed herself to since the day she'd crashed into his car. She saw the tiredness behind the confidence, the loneliness that Victoria Chen Sterling had diagnosed and he hadn't denied. She saw a man who was very good at fixing systems and very bad at fixing himself. I trust you, she said. Don't make me regret it. Marcus made his move on a Tuesday. Sarah arrived at the distribution hub for her morning shift to find her access badge deactivated. When she approached the loading dock, one of Marcus's junior supervisors, a nervous kid named Tyler, who clearly hated his role in this, met her at the door with a tablet displaying her driver profile. Ms. Thornton, your account has been suspended pending investigation into multiple customer service violations. What violations? Tyler scrolled to the tablet without meeting her eyes. Late deliveries, failure to follow prescribed routes, unauthorized communication with competing logistics firms. He paused, swallowed. I'm sorry, I'm just reading what it says. Sarah looked past Tyler into the hub, where 30 or 40 drivers were loading their vehicles for the morning rush. Some of them glanced at her. Most looked away quickly, the survival instinct of people who couldn't afford to be associated with someone the system had marked for removal. But a few didn't look away. Javier, standing beside his aging Honda Civic, held her gaze and gave her a single small nod. Marcus appeared in the loading dock doorway, coffee in hand, wearing the expression of a man who had just solved a minor administrative problem. Thorntonbaum, he called out loud enough for the entire hub to hear. A word of advice. Next time you want to play whistleblower, make sure you're not delivering for the company you're trying to blow the whistle on. This isn't a movie. There's no hero coming to save you. Sarah said nothing. She removed her Fastel cap, folded it neatly, a gesture that confused Marcus, who'd expected tears or anger or begging, placed it on the supervisor's tablet, and walked to her scooter. She didn't cry until she was 3 blocks away, stopped at a red light on King Street where nobody could see her except the algorithm, which didn't care. Remember what Javier said? This isn't a movie. There's no hero coming to save you. Marcus said the exact same words, and he believed them because, in his experience, that's how the world worked. The system protected people like him and crushed people like Sarah. That had always been true. It had been true for 3 years, through 40 drivers, through hundreds of thousands of stolen dollars. Why would it be any different now? What Marcus didn't understand, what people like Marcus never understand, is that integrity doesn't need a hero. It needs a witness, and Sarah had found one. 22 hours later, Marcus Vance stood at the front of the Fastel Southeast Regional Meeting Room, addressing 47 employees about the company's new commission structure. A 12% cut across the board, effective immediately, framed as a market adjustment for operational sustainability. He was midway through a PowerPoint slide about driver partnership and mutual growth when every screen in the building went dark. For 2 seconds, the room was silent. Then the screens came back to life. But instead of Marcus's PowerPoint, they displayed something else entirely. A scrolling feed of financial audit data, transaction logs, tip allocation records, internal routing override commands, and bank transfer records linked to a personal account. Marcus's personal account. The loading dock doors opened. David Sterling walked in first. He was wearing a suit again, the charcoal one from the night of the accident, and he wore it the way a general wears armor, not for decoration but for purpose. Behind him was Claire Huang carrying a leather portfolio, and behind Claire was a man in a dark blue suit whom several employees recognized from news coverage, Robert Kessler, the U.S. Attorney for the District of South Carolina. And behind all of them, in a clean white shirt and jeans, was Sarah. David didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he spoke, the room went still the way rooms do when the person speaking has the power to change the weather. As of 11 p.m. last night, Sterling Logistics completed the acquisition of a controlling interest in Fastdell Inc. He paused, letting the information settle. Effective immediately, all regional operations are under review. Mr. Kessler's office has received a comprehensive audit of financial irregularities within this division, including the systematic misappropriation of driver gratuities totaling approximately $340,000 over 37 months. Marcus's coffee cup hit the floor. He didn't notice. Mr. Vance? David's gaze found Marcus with surgical precision. You enjoyed using the algorithm to control people's lives. You treated drivers as expendable variables in a system designed to extract maximum value from minimum investment. He stepped aside, revealing the screen behind him where Marcus's routing overrides were displayed in damning chronological order. Every driver he'd punished, every tip he'd skimmed, every account he'd suspended for daring to question his authority. As of this morning, but David continued, the Department of Justice has frozen your personal assets pending a federal wire fraud investigation. Your Fastdell equity has been forfeit under the company's misconduct clawback provisions. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He looked like a fish pulled from water, gasping at an atmosphere it had never been designed to breathe. But I'm not going to fire you, David said. The room shifted. Even Sarah looked at him confused. Under the terms of your employment contract, termination with cause would trigger a severance dispute that could drag through courts for years. Instead, effective today, you are reassigned to the position of Level 1 Delivery Associate, Southeast Region. You will complete deliveries on the same routes, under the same algorithmic constraints, and subject to the same performance metrics that you imposed on your drivers. Your compensation will be garnished at a rate determined by the court to repay every dollar you stole. David leaned forward slightly, and his voice dropped to a register that Sarah had never heard. Quiet, controlled, and absolutely merciless. You will deliver food in the rain, Marcus. You will feel your completion rate drop because a customer didn't answer their door. You will watch the algorithm send you to the far side of the county for a $3.50 payout. And you will do it until every driver you robbed has been made whole. If you resign, the criminal case proceeds uncontested. If you stay, you might avoid prison. There's a concept in restorative justice called experiential accountability. The idea that the most effective punishment isn't incarceration or financial penalty, but forcing the offender to experience the exact suffering they inflicted on others. It's controversial. Many legal scholars argue it borders on cruel and unusual, but there's a reason it resonates so deeply when we hear stories like this. Because most of us have worked for a Marcus. Most of us have felt the boot of someone who had just enough power to make our lives miserable and just enough protection to face no consequences for it. The fantasy of watching that person sit on the other side of the desk, not metaphorically, but literally, delivering food in the rain for $3.50 an order, speaks to something primal in our sense of justice. Marcus's face had gone the color of wet cement. Javier, standing near the back of the room with the other drivers, crossed his arms and smiled for the first time in 3 years. The aftermath was quieter than the storm. Sterling Logistics implemented a new driver compensation framework within 2 weeks. Transparent tip allocation, minimum earnings guarantees, weather-adjusted delivery windows, and a driver advisory council with actual authority. Sarah was offered a permanent position as director of field operations. She turned it down. Why? David asked, genuinely confused. Standing in his office as Claire discreetly closed the door behind her. Because I didn't do this for a title, Sarah said. I did it because 40 people were being robbed and nobody with power was paying attention. So what do you want? She thought about it, really thought, the way she hadn't allowed herself to think since the day she'd left design school, about what she wanted instead of what she needed, about possibility instead of survival. I want to finish my degree, she said, and I want to design delivery vehicles that don't kill their drivers. Electric, weather-protected, affordable, the kind of thing that would have kept me from sliding into your stupid car in the first place. David laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and Sarah realized it was the first time she'd heard him laugh in 8 weeks of working together. I can fund a design program, he said. I don't want your funding. I want a scholarship. I'll apply. I'll compete. I'll earn it. If I get in, the degree is mine, not a gift from the man whose car I wrecked. You're the most stubborn person I've ever met. I'm the most honest person you've ever met. There's a difference. And this brings us to the final chapter of this story, the part that, honestly, I didn't expect to affect me as much as it did. On the last evening of their 3-month agreement, David asked Sarah to meet him on Trod Street. She arrived on her scooter, the same one still screaming above 30 miles per hour, though David's mechanics had quietly replaced the brakes and tires without telling her, a fact she pretended not to know. He was standing near the spot where the Ferrari had been parked. The car was gone, sent to a specialist in Modena for restoration. In its place was an empty stretch of cobblestone, still stained faintly with the residue of shattered taillight glass that Charleston's rain hadn't quite washed away. David reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a piece of paper, thin, crumpled, and familiar. Sarah's delivery receipt, her handwriting, her promise. He held it up so she could see it in the golden evening light, the same light that had illuminated the worst moment of her life 11 weeks earlier. The project data you provided has already saved the company more than the cost of the car. Your debt is cleared. He tore the receipt in half, then in quarters. The pieces drifted to the cobblestones like confetti at the quietest celebration in the world. Sarah watched the fragments settle. She felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was clenched. Thank you, she said, for seeing an investment instead of a liability. I never saw either of those things, David said. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the tiredness behind his eyes and the hope that was trying cautiously to replace it. I saw a woman with $112 to her name willing to mortgage her entire future rather than run from what she owed. I've negotiated with heads of state, Sarah. I've sat across from billionaires and con artists and everything in between, and I have never, not once, seen anyone sign their life away out of pure integrity. He reached down and took her hands. They were calloused, scarred at the knuckles, the hands of someone who worked for every cent she'd ever earned. I tore up the old contract, David said quietly, but I'd like to propose a new one that doesn't involve debt or consulting fees or 3-month timelines. What does it involve? Time, as much of it as you'll give me. Not as your employer, not as the man whose car you wrecked. He paused. As someone who'd very much like to stand beside you, not above you, beside. Sarah looked at him. She looked at the cobblestones where the receipt fragments lay, at the empty space where a $2 million car had once been parked, at the oak trees overhead whose falling branch had started all of this. I'll think about it, she said. David blinked. You'll think about it? I'll think about it. I don't sign contracts on impulse, especially not with billionaires. She was smiling now, the first real, unguarded smile he'd ever seen from her, and it hit him harder than any crash ever could. Pick me up tomorrow, 8 o'clock, and leave the Ferrari at home. We're taking the scooter. She climbed back onto her battered little machine, kicked the engine to life, and rode away down Trad Street in the golden light, the sound of the motor fading slowly into the warm Charleston evening. David stood there for a long time after she'd gone, his hands in his pockets, a torn receipt at his feet, and the unmistakable feeling that the most valuable thing he'd ever found had just driven away on a vehicle worth less than his watch, and that she'd be back tomorrow because Sarah Thornton always kept her word. And that, I think, is the real lesson of this story. Not that billionaires can save delivery drivers. That's a fantasy. Not that love conquers all. That's a cliche. The lesson is simpler and harder than both. That the choices you make when no one important is watching are the only choices that matter. Sarah didn't know David was standing there when she wrote that note. She didn't know it would change her life. She wrote it because her father had driven 45 minutes to return $5 and some debts, the ones we owe to the people who raised us, to the values they planted in us. Those debts can't be calculated on a receipt, can't be paid off in monthly installments, and can't be torn up on a Tuesday evening. They can only be honored one choice at a time for the rest of your life. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a story. We bring you a new one every single day. Stories about ordinary people making extraordinary choices when no one is watching. Thank you for staying until the very end. That says something about you too.